Well, good afternoon, everyone. Are we okay? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming on a raw spring day. Delighted that you could be here. My name is Richard Samuels, and I direct the Center for International Studies and teach in the Political Science Department here at MIT. We're here to discuss the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, which are 5 small uninhabited islands and 3 rocky outcroppings that are northeast of Taiwan and west of Okinawa that have a total landmass of less than 3 square miles. But this is not a symposium on the geosciences. And so we're actually here to discuss how the history and the ambitions that surround these disputed territories touch really the third rail of sovereignty and national identity, and possibly, the fear is, could spark a military confrontation between the world's second and third largest economies. And now I'm going to leave it to our panelists this afternoon to define the conflict on the assumption that any framing that I might provide on the front end would get in way of a direct conversation among them and with you. So that said, though, I think it's still worth remembering that the current contretemps in the East China Sea is not the first over these islets. Tensions have spiked periodically, but none with the current level of mutual vituperation, of global attention, and I dare say danger. Each side reports being provoked by the other. China by Japan's nationalization of the islands last fall, which it claims upset the status quo. I'm sure we'll hear more about that. And Japan by the behavior of the Chinese merchant fleet and the Chinese military, which it claims has been intrusive in the Japanese territory. Moreover, public opinion in both countries has been inflamed. Japanese product sales in China tanked last year after anti-Japanese, often violent, anti-Japanese demonstrations, and in response, more than 80% of the Japanese who were surveyed recently in a nationwide poll reported that they had no sense of friendship toward China. This is a sort of a record high, at least a record high since the normalization of relations. And all of this is of great consequence to the United States, of course, because it's the first consequential challenge to Japanese national security under the Japan-U.S. Mutual Security Treaty, which has been in effect for 6 decades. Washington knows that if it fails to signal reassurance to Japan, Japan will reconsider the value of the treaty. And it knows also that if its signals are judged to be too strong by Beijing, that it will reconfirm views in Beijing of the U.S. as coercive, as aggressive, and as harboring containment strategies, stimulating further tension and further tests of all these relationships. So amidst all these mutually vituperative charges and dueling paramilitary patrols, U.S. policy at least seems to have been designed to create an atmosphere in which both sides can dial back the confrontation and resume the status quo ante, which was widely characterized as warm economic ties and cold political ties. Now, one fear is that even if all parties seem to be probing for avenues toward de-escalation, none may be in full enough control of its actions on the sea and in the air near the islands. There's concern in Japan that the Chinese Communist Party is not in full control of the People's Liberation Army, and there is concern in China that Tokyo now has tilted very hard in the direction of nationalist excess, abetted by Washington. And there's concern in Washington that missteps on our part, on the U.S. part, could undermine the guarantees of extended deterrence and usher in a new arms race, and a dangerously new arms race in the region. Both countries are watching carefully to see if the United States can prevent a fight between China and Japan, and each is eager to know that if a fight breaks out, whether or not the United States will be willing and able to stop it. So there's a lot at stake for all the parties in this dispute. And as our colleague, the historian Alexis Dudden at the University of Connecticut reminds us, in world politics, islands everywhere increasingly contain the oceans that surround them, rather than the reverse. I think that's a way to think about this that is very useful. Now, here to discuss all this is a very distinguished group of scholars and practitioners, and I'm delighted that we have such a distinguished group with us today. I'm going to introduce them just roll, along the line in which they're sitting, and then they will come and make presentations to you for about 15 minutes, with the idea that at the end they will be able to engage you in a direct conversation. First, Mike Mochizuki holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Seeger at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he was director of the Seeger Center from 2001 through 2005. He's been a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He was co-director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at the Rand Corporation, and has published widely on East Asian security and the U.S.-Japan alliance. He's currently completing a book that's entitled A New Strategic Triangle, the U.S.-Japan Alliance and the Rise of China. M. Taylor Fravel, our second speaker, is the Associate Professor of Political Science and a member of the Security Studies program here at MIT. After earning his PhD at Stanford University, Taylor was a postdoctoral fellow at the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard and has been a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences here in Cambridge. He also has, he also has graduate degrees from the University, from the London School of Economics and from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Like Professor Mochizuki, Professor Fravel has published widely on Asian security issues, particularly with regard to territorial disputes involving China. His book, Strong Borders, Secure Nation, Cooperation and Conflict in China's Territorial Disputes, was published by Princeton University Press in 2008. Liu Weimin is Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in the United States. Mr. Liu graduated from the Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, and after joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has been posted to embassies in Mauritius, in Brussels, at the European Union, and at the United Kingdom. In 2011, he served as a counselor of the Information Department and spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry. In 2005 and 2006, he was a fellow, visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And finally, Professor Charles Glaser is professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs in the Department of Political Science and director of the Elliott School's Institute for Security and Conflict Studies at the George Washington University. Professor Glaser earned his PhD here in Cambridge from the Kennedy School of Government, but I'm proud to say his undergraduate degree was in physics here at MIT. I had to get that in. Before departing and migrating to George Washington, he served, he was a professor of public policy and the deputy dean at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He served on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon and is the author most recently of the widely acclaimed Rational Theory of International Politics. He's also, again, with pride I note, he's also been a research fellow and a research associate here at the MIT Center for International Studies. With the preliminaries completed, then let me turn the...
I know where you are trying to lead.
Oh, did I leave you out? Oh! 申し訳ない。すいません。Yukio Okamoto is a very close friend. And is the Robert Wilhelm Fellow at the MIT Center for International Studies. He served for 2 decades in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where, among other responsibilities, he was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the U.S.-Japan security relationship. In 1991, he left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the private sector, but he had already served as political counselor in the Japanese embassy in Washington and as Director of National Security Affairs Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo. He has served as special advisor to the Prime Minister for Okinawa Affairs, which is a sub-cabinet post just below the level of minister. And has also been an advisor to the Minister of Science and Technology. He's a familiar figure in Japan for his many television appearances, and he may or may not forgive me for leaving him out the first time through. Mike?
Thank you very much, Dick, for organizing the symposium and inviting me to participate. This is very an important and timely event. Since I only have 15 minutes, I'm going to basically focus on just two questions. One is how and why are we in the mess we are in now? And secondly, to look at what Japan's calculations, motivations are regarding the dispute over the Senkaku-Dairyu Islands since this latest round of a crisis erupted in 2012. Now, this first question about why we are in this mess may not seem too puzzling, but when one looks at a lot of the writings over the last couple of decades, a lot of the writings have addressed the puzzle of why, despite this dispute, Japan and China have managed to avoid escalation and avoid a risk of a military confrontation. In fact, Taylor wrote an excellent piece on this several years ago, in which he argued that the reason why we haven't seen this kind of military confrontation is because the two countries have had an active dispute management and conflict avoidance strategy. And so it begs the question of why this dispute management and conflict avoidance pattern of interaction has unraveled. And, as a political scientist, I guess the first type of explanation that I might turn to would be a realist explanation that would look at threats and the distribution of power, in fact, the change in the distribution of power. And the argument would go something like this. During the Cold War, especially the latter stages of the Cold War, China was concerned about the Soviet threat, and so was Japan. And the two countries decided to put aside the territorial issue because they had a common strategic concern. Once the Cold War ended, then that strategic calculation disappeared, and then the territorial dispute began to erupt. The other realist argument is one that relates to power distribution, and it goes back to the classic Thucydides argument that China is rising and Japan fears the rise of China. As China rises, its ambitions increase, its assertiveness increase, and conversely, the Japanese fear this, and therefore they fear they move to take a much firmer stance. Now, at a very general level, I think this kind of realist reasoning explains quite a bit in terms of the long-term trends. But when you look at the details of how this dispute has evolved and how the two countries have interacted, it doesn't fully capture a lot of the variations we see over time. And so then when one turns to another kind of explanation that we often see in the journalistic commentary, it's the explanation that Japan and China are on the rocks over this issue because of a clash of nationalisms. And China, on the one hand, after 1989, and the emphasis on patriotic education, has educated generations of young Chinese who are patriotic, and their patriotism is defined in very negative terms vis-a-vis Japan. And by the same token, some argue that you see a similar kind of populist nationalism rising in Japan. Again, just like the realist explanation, that goes part of the way, but I don't find it completely satisfactory for a number of reasons. One, I'm not really sure that in Japan you see much greater nationalism on the population as a whole than before. And again, when one looks at the variations in terms of the way the two countries interacted, nationalism in itself cannot explain those variations over time. And so the explanation that I favor is one that, of course, takes the power variable, the threat variable, and the nationalist variable as contextual factors, but in the end, it has a lot to do with the capacity of the leaderships in both countries to manage this issue. In China, there has been a rise of anti-Japanese sentiment, but at certain moments in time, China has been able to manage this issue. But I would argue that over time, with increasing pluralization of the policy process and a decline of the state capacity to come up with a coherent response to this issue has contributed to the tensions. And by the same token, on the Japanese side, although I would not say that there is increasing Japanese nationalism, as Dick mentioned, there's no question that the negative view of China has increased. This is multi-causal. It's not just a territorial issue, but a whole variety of developments since 1989. But again, like in the Chinese side, it's been the decline of the capacity of the Japanese leadership to manage the nationalist wing of the Japanese polity. And it's not just because there might be the decline of the so-called China school in the foreign ministry, but it's also a decline of, or the disappearance of very influential politicians who cared about stable relations with China and who had the political clout and the pipe to China in order to manage tensions. And so it's the interplay of these two factors, I think, provide a more complete explanation of why we are now on the rocks. Now, one way of framing this issue is to ask the question, why did the understanding to shelve this problem, and this has been talked about a lot, that in 1972 and in 1978, the two countries had a tacit understanding of shelving the issue. Now, today, the Japanese government denies there was such an agreement. In fact, if you go to their website, if you frame it in Chinese fashion, the Japanese have clearly enunciated the three no's. No, there is no territorial issue. No, Japan did not recognize that there was a territorial issue in 1972 during the normalization talks, and not during the negotiations for the Peace and Friendship Treaty in 1979. And no, there is no agreement to maintain the status quo or to shelve the issue. But if you look at a lot of the circumstantial evidence, there seems to be at least some kind of tacit, or what some people call a silent understanding, to put this issue aside in order to develop Sino-Japanese relations. But the problem is, even though there was a silent understanding, there was no clear operationalization of this silent understanding. What does shelving of the issue mean? Did it mean that there would be no new structures constructed on the islands, no landings by Chinese activists, Hong Kong activists, Taiwan activists, Japanese activists, that there would be no intrusions by Chinese or Taiwanese vessels into the territorial waters of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands? Well, those things were never part of any kind of silent understanding. And what happened was that over time, because of certain patterns of interaction, certain kind of norms of behavior came to be established. And this developed over a historical process. Part of it had to do in the latter Cold War period when China had a keen interest in signing a peace and friendship treaty with Japan. One of the first periods of intense friction over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands took place, in fact, just at the time that Japan and China were negotiating the peace and friendship treaty. In 1978, Japanese activists constructed a lighthouse on one of the islands. We don't know whether this was a direct response to that, but around the same time, 140 Chinese fishing boats amassed near the islands, and 10 of them intruded into the territorial waters of the Senkakus. This became an issue, and Foreign Minister Sonoda had a meeting with Deng Xiaoping and called him on it, and Deng Xiaoping said this would never happen again. And this opened the way for the signing of the Peace and Friendship Treaty. The Japanese at the time also made some conciliatory gestures. They did not continue to pursue the survey of these islands. They also refrained from a plan of the Maritime Safety Agency to construct a heliport on the islands, and they stopped from doing that. So you could say that geostrategic calculations played a role in that restraint. Now, after the Cold War, from 1990 and to about 2010, I would say that there were a multiplicity of incidents and frictions between China and Japan. Whether it was in 1990 or 1996, 97 with the lighthouse and activists landing on the islands, or in 2004. But when you look at all of these episodes, a few things are quite striking. One is, despite the strong nationalistic calls in China for much tougher measures, the Chinese state exercised quite a bit of restraint and paid some political costs in terms of legitimacy. Also, the Japanese tended to make partial concessions. For example, the Japanese refrained from giving official recognition to the renovation of the lighthouse, or they decided not to detain Chinese who have landed on the islands. In fact, they deported them rapidly. And in fact, in 2002, the Japanese government leased 3 of the islands in order to have greater control and prevent such kind of landings by Japanese activists. Also during this period, in 1997, the Chinese and the Japanese signed a fishing agreement which encompassed the area surrounding the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and there seemed to have been the establishment of a certain understanding that there would be self-policing of fishing boats. So this, you could say, is a period of kind of Chinese restraint and Japanese conciliation. Now, there are a couple of episodes during this period which shows the limit of China's capacity to kind of keep things on kind of an even keel. First is in 1992, when the law of the territorial sea was passed in China. And this is pointed out by many Japanese as a seminal event because China named the Diaoyu Islands in that piece of legislation. And those who say that Japan recognized the shelving of this issue thought that China had broken that agreement. Also, an indicator of the limits of China's capacity to keep this issue at an even keel. And one interesting thing about the 1992 legislation is that, according to some scholars, early drafts of that legislation did not include the Dalu. And as it went through the process, Dalu was tacked on, and probably for domestic political reasons. Another case is June 2008, the agreement for joint development in the East China Sea, the resources there. And as I look at this, this was a bold measure by Hu Jintao to stabilize relations with Japan. But as soon as it was announced, he was harshly criticized. This is probably the one major initiative by President Hu that kind of provoked severe criticism in China. And the criticism was that this gave too much to the Japanese. It basically was an agreement that would give tacit agreement, kind of tacit acquiescence to the median line in the East China Sea that the Japanese had been insisting on. And secondly, because it ignored the territorial dispute, this was a kind of shrewd way by the Japanese to get China to sign on to a treaty, which then the Japanese could say, here, the Chinese recognize that there is no territorial dispute. Now, I would argue that things changed completely after 2010. This was a major turning point. And there were at least a couple of mistakes by the DPJ government at the time. One is that, unlike Prime Minister Koizumi, the Japanese government did not deport the fishing trawler captain in a timely fashion, but threatened to go through with a domestic legal process. And this, to the Chinese mind, was a departure from the norms that had been developed. Secondly, under Chinese pressure, then the Khan government backed down, used the legal fig leaf, but it was quite clear to everybody that it was Chinese pressure that led to the release of the fishing trawler captain. And facing the criticism from the Japanese public, and especially the nationalist wing, the DPJ had no choice but to insist that there was no territorial dispute between China and Japan. And then in September 2012, in order to try to outflank Ishihara, the Noda government decided to purchase the islands on behalf of the central government. And for me, the critical thing here is that given the mistake of September 2010, it was impossible for the criticize Ishihara. And therefore, as a result of this, the Chinese interpreted this as not as a conflict avoidance strategy, but as a conspiracy between Prime Minister Noda and Governor Ishihara to, in fact, change the status quo. Okay, so I think that's how we got into the mess. Just very quickly, what are Japanese calculations and motivations? And Japan is not single-minded on this, although I think there is a government calculation. But, and Dick will not be surprised to hear this, but I think there are basically 4 schools of thought on this. And I would call them the appeasers, the militarizers, the balancers, and the shelvers. The appeasers are those who argue that Japan needs stable relations with China, and the best way to do this is to meet China halfway and to accept joint administration over the islands. And Professor Susumu Yabuki of Yokohama National University has been an advocate of that strategy. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the militarizers who feel that the only way to keep China from encroaching on the sovereignty and the control of the Senkaku Islands is to use the Japanese self-defense force, and even deploying forces near the islands. And by beefing up Japan's defense, Japan can protect its territorial interests. Those are the extremes. And I believe that the Abe government is taking the third approach, which is called balancing. And here, the strategy is of Japan presenting themselves as exercising caution, exercising restraint, and strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance, but not to be too provocative, because there is an understanding that the United States support is contingent on being provocative. But the main part of the strategy is to put the burden on China, and that China's provocative, to show to the world that China's provocative behavior in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands is part of a Chinese strategy in other parts of Asia, like the South China Sea. And with that, Japan could help forge a balancing coalition to China and raise the costs of this kind of provocation, and ultimately China might back down. But there is an alternative school of thought, which I would call the shelvers. And it's interesting that the advocates of this viewpoint, some of the most prominent are former officials of the foreign ministry, like Kazuhiko Togo or Ukeru Magosaki. They argue that Japan should go back to some kind of understanding about shelving and engage in a process of reciprocal de-escalation. And this might entail some public acknowledgement that there is a dispute, that China, in fact, disagrees with the Japanese position. And after such recognition, then the two sides can take reciprocal actions to de-escalate and then ultimately move towards joint development. Thank you.
Great. Mike is a hard act to follow, especially since he flagged an article that I wrote several years ago saying that the situation was all well and good in the East China Sea and we didn't really have to worry very much. So students in the audience, your professors can often be wrong.
You were right then.
I was right until I was wrong. So in my brief remarks, I have one main point I want to make, which is that the current standoff over the islands is inherently dangerous. The current situation is inherently dangerous. It is inherently dangerous because of the dynamics of the security dilemma, both in general terms and when applied to territorial disputes. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about some ways in which the inherent danger perhaps can be removed, although not completely. So the security dilemma is a general concept in international relations that political scientists like to use. It refers to actions that one state might take to increase its own security that it views as defensive and benign, threaten the security and the interests of another state. It's a dilemma because, sort of in general terms, there's no specific conflict of interest. There's just these unilateral actions that states take to improve their own positions. And it's often reflected in defense spending and ultimately can lead to sort of very competitive arms races that increase the probability of conflict among states. And we actually see this between China and Japan today as a result of China's sort of decades of economic growth. China's economy has grown at an average rate of 10% per year for 3 decades, a remarkable achievement. But that also means that China's defense budget, especially since the early 1990s, has grown quite substantially. And China's budgets for other government agencies, such as the China Marine Surveillance Force or the Bureau of Fisheries Administration, have also grown appreciably. And so over time, Chinese sort of maritime capabilities have increased substantially, and that sort of by definition, I think, creates some anxiety in Japan, especially since around 2008, which is when I think, for the first time, a task force from the People's Liberation Army Navy conducted sort of an exercise in the Western Pacific through through which it sort of circumnavigated the Japanese islands. But I want to talk about this concept with respect to territorial disputes. So like security, territorial conflicts are zero-sum contests over the control or ownership of land. In any territorial dispute, only one country can ultimately claim ownership or sovereignty over a piece of land. And thus, when you have a dispute, when you have conflicting claims to ownership over the same piece of land, the actions that one state might take to improve its own position in that dispute will inherently weaken the other side and will be viewed as offensive, even though the state taking those actions might view them as sort of benign and defensive. As a result, you get these spirals that can sort of get started in territorial disputes, even if there are long periods of stability. And states believe that they are actually acting out of good motives, out of defensive motives, and that the other side is the aggressor, or the other side is a state that is posing the change to the status quo. And I think this explains how we got to where we are today, and Mike has already covered this quite well, so I'll talk about it briefly, quite briefly. In December 2008, for the first time, I believe, ships from the China Marine Surveillance Force, which is a civilian maritime law enforcement agency under the State Oceanic Administration in China, entered for the first time the 12 nautical mile mark that demarcated the territorial waters or the territorial seas around the Senkaku Islands. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a state enjoys more or less the equivalent of national sovereignty over its territorial waters or its territorial seas, and Japan had issued baselines sort of demarcating these waters. And so this was seen as a violation of Japanese sovereignty by Chinese government ships, not fishing ships, as happened earlier, but actually Chinese government vessels that would be acting under the authority under the authority of the Chinese government. And this was December 2008. Then fast forward to 2010, September, and when this fishing captain enters the 12 nautical mile zone around the islands, and then the Japanese Coast Guard attempts to detain him, during which he collides with several Japanese Coast Guard vessels. And then rather than being deported within 48 hours, he is actually kept for more than 2 weeks. And as Mike mentioned, the Japanese government was considering whether or not to indict him under domestic Japanese law for the offenses that he conducted within Japan's territorial waters. And from China's perspective, this was a new challenge to its claim because it had it was sort of for the first time, I think ever, that Japan sought to use her domestic law to detain and try a Chinese citizen, excuse me, for from sort of Chinese eyes conducting lawful activities within China's own waters. And so you can see how this spiral gets started. And after the September 2010 incident, China decides on a somewhat periodic basis to send ships from a different civil maritime law enforcement agency, the Bureau of Fisheries Administration under the Ministry of Agriculture, to the waters around the islands. And on several occasions, in August 2011 and March of 2012, vessels from this bureau actually entered the territorial waters around the islands. Right before Shintaro Ishihara, the conservative governor of Tokyo, announces his intention to buy the 3 islands that were currently owned by a private Japanese citizen. And so you can see how this action-reaction chain gets going and the spiral gets started. Now, it started off kind of slowly back in 2008. No one at the time really thought this was going to lead to much. And after all, my article about stability was published in 2010, and I knew what happened in 2008. But nevertheless, by sort of early 2012, the situation was pretty dicey. And then in July, Prime Minister Noda announces his intention to buy the islands, and unfortunately, this gets described as nationalization, which sounds as it has greater implications for sovereignty claims and probably was the case or would be the case under international law. And when the deal is completed in early September, there's a pretty strong reaction from China, which you all know about. China issued baselines around the islands, thus demarcating its own territorial seas where it claimed sovereignty, and then began systematically to send task forces of ships from the China Marine Surveillance Force into these waters. And between sort of September of 2012 and today, I think there have been roughly 36 times when task forces from the China Marine Surveillance Force have entered the waters around the islands. And as a result of this, I think relations between the two have really sort of nosedived. And I'm not an expert on Chinese-Japanese relations, but my sense is that they're probably the worst they've been in a decade, at least at the political level. At the highest levels, there's not a lot of dialogue. Even at the higher working levels, at the vice ministerial level, there's a little bit of dialogue in the fall, but not much anymore. There could be sort of private diplomacy going on. I hope that's the case, but at least publicly we can't observe that, and that's quite worrying. As Dick mentioned in his opening remarks, China's image in Japan has never been lower than it is today. I think affinity for China in Japan among these surveys that are conducted by the Cabinet Office is now 4.8%. 4.8% of the Japanese public has a positive view of China. The rest of the Japanese public does not. And this decline can actually sort of be traced back to the events that happened in 2010. You know, one wouldn't want to sort of say this was Monte causal, but clearly I think China's behavior in these disputes has had a very significant impact on Japanese public opinion about China. So we're in this sort of tailspin, and neither side is really better off, right? Because inherently the risk of military conflict, I think, now has increased. And this is where I want to bring the security dilemma sort of back a little bit to my main point about sort of inherent danger that we have here. The number of boats from the governments on both sides and the waters around the islands have increased dramatically. As I said, 36 task forces of Chinese ships have entered the water since September 2012. These task forces usually have 3 or 4 ships, so the Japanese Coast Guard sends out 3 or 4 ships to escort them. And this is a pattern of behavior that we really haven't witnessed before. The probability of some sort of incident occurring sort of has been growing and growing and growing. And I think it's sort of reached a high point in sort of December and January. In the middle of December, an airplane from the China Marine Surveillance Force entered the airspace over the islands. This was the first time that sort of the conflict had escalated from entering sort of the waters around the islands to the airspace. And because the Japanese Coast Guard doesn't have its own sort of air wing, the only way in which Japan could sort of intercept and track this flight was to launch fighter jets from the Air Self-Defense Forces. So 8 fighter jets were launched in response to this one unarmed plane, and that threatened to sort of militarize something that hadn't yet been militarized before. But it was clearly a very provocative act. Now, from China's perspective, this might have been wholly within their rights. After all, they claim sovereignty over the islands, and they have demarcated their territorial waters around the islands. But nevertheless, from the Japanese perspective, it was seen as a real escalation. And then we had these incidents, which are still a bit murky, in January, where Chinese warships may have turned on and sort of pointed their fire control radars at a Japanese helicopter and a Japanese ship. Again, the details here are a little bit murky, but that's sort of besides the point, right? Because it could still be viewed as offensive by the Japanese maritime self-defense forces. And the next time this happens, Japan might decide that, hey, it needs to turn on its fire control radar because it might be under attack. Imagine if there's fog, for example, you can't see the other ship, you can't make visual identification. If that happens and China observes that, then China might decide, well, maybe we need to turn on some more fire control radars and aim some more things at Japan, and so on and so on. All of a sudden, shots get fired. That's one way in which I think this situation kind of spiral out of control. Another way might just have to do with the simple or unintended accident, or sorry, an unintended incident. It wouldn't really be an accident because ships are going to be in the vicinity. But imagine if the sea state's really choppy and China sends a task force to patrol the territorial waters. Japan sends a task force to counter them. Ships collide. Personnel from each country fall overboard. They can't be rescued. They die. All of a sudden now, in the defense of sovereignty claims, you have dead government personnel. That would put intense pressure, I think, on the governments of both sides, even though initially both sides have claimed that their actions were defensively motivated. And so this situation really, I think, is really primed for escalation. It's not foreordained. I think in the last month we've seen, I think, cooler rhetoric, and I think we've seen fewer ships in the area, and that's all very positive, but I think much more needs to be done. Because if there were an incident of either type that I described, either between naval ships or between these unarmed civil maritime law enforcement agencies, the repercussions would really be, I think, far-reaching. Even if it was a somewhat minor clash and it only lasted for a day, I think it would really have the potential to sort of harden political divisions throughout the region, sort of dividing China and creating further divisions between China and other countries in the region. So what can be done? I think there are 3 or 4 things that can be done. The first is to recognize that you're in this situation, that you're in this kind of action-reaction spiral where actions you think are purely defensively oriented are actually going to be viewed as quite threatening by the other side. And thus you might want to think twice about the actions that you take, not because you're not within your rights to take them, but because they might be counterproductive. They might put you in a situation that's actually even worse off than you otherwise might be, which I submit would be the case up until this point. This also requires some empathy from both sides. When Prime Minister Noda announced his decision to buy the islands from the private Japanese citizen, he did so on July 7th. July 7th is an important date in Chinese-Japanese relations. It's the anniversary of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which commemorates, in Chinese eyes, the initiation of Japan's effort in World War II to conquer all of China. Not the best date in which to sort of make any sort of statement regarding territorial sovereignty, even if you're going to go ahead and do that. Likewise, after it happened, several senior officials from the Foreign Ministry likened the purchase of the islands by Japan to the dropping of an atomic bomb on China, and hardly the purchase of the islands can't be compared to what happened in the Second World War at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So some empathy is needed, and recognition of the situation is needed. Secondly, I think both sides, but here the impetus would really come from China, I think need to routinize and regularize their patrols. I'm under no illusions that this dispute is going to be solved anytime soon. The positions are quite hard. As Mike mentioned, there isn't even acknowledgement or agreement as to whether or not there is, in fact, a dispute. But steps can be taken on the water and in the air to minimize the potential for escalation. And here we could actually look to modern Chinese history and a different dispute. China was involved in the height of the Cold War with Taiwan. Over islands that the nationalists held just off the coast of Fujian and Zhejiang provinces, Jinmen and Mazu. And there are 2 big crises in 54 and in 58. And then after the 58 crisis, when Chiang Kai-shek was considering withdrawing his troops back to the mainland, back to Taiwan, thus sort of creating some sort of permanent separation between Taiwan and the mainland, Mao decided that Jinmen should only be shelled on odd-numbered days. And then after 1961, Jinmen was only shelled with propaganda leaflets. And this happened until 1979, but it was routinized and regularized. And I think it was like 10:30 in the morning or at some appointed time that the propaganda leaflets would be fired, the point would be made, and everyone would go home. So China has made its point that it does not accept exclusive Japanese control over the waters around the islands. The point has been made. The question is, how often does China need to make the point? Once a week? Once a month? Once every other month? This is a choice. This is a political choice. And I think if these patrols, the frequency were reduced, and if they became regularized in some way, people could continue to make their points, but the probability of an incident occurring would be greatly reduced. I think air patrols over the islands should just be avoided. They have a high potential to become militarized, and thankfully they haven't. The incident that happened in December hasn't been repeated since then. China and Japan actually have 2 mechanisms underway that they could kickstart to also help increase communications. One is a maritime communications mechanism, which has debated establishing a hotline between naval forces. And I think these talks actually achieved quite a lot of progress. There have been 3 rounds at the working group level, and it should be completed. This is when you need a hotline, right? You might have needed a hotline in January when you had the fire control radar incident happening. In addition, ironically enough, in early 2012, the 2 sides began a high-level consultative mechanism on maritime affairs that included representatives from these civil maritime law enforcement agencies in China and the Coast Guard in Japan. And that should be continued because that would allow, for predictability to be brought to the waters in the area. And then finally, I think greater effort needs to be made to reduce the value or the importance of sovereignty over the islands. Both sides will continue to claim sovereignty for a very long time to come. I don't doubt that. But how important that is can be altered. And so in general terms, apart from the symbolic value associated with them, which I can appreciate might be quite high on both sides, disputed islands are also important for functional reasons because you can generate an exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and thus exclusive rights to the fish in the water column and the resources in the seabed. But states can come to agreements as to how to share these resources without having to agree who has sovereignty over what. And earlier this week, Japan and Taiwan, completed an agreement that sort of created a fishing zone around the Senkaku Islands, but exempted the 12 nautical mile territorial seas. China and Japan already have a fishing agreement, although it doesn't extend this far south, and that could be extended to the south, perhaps preventing the types of incidents that we saw in September of 2010. Likewise, the 2008 agreement could be implemented further going forward. So all of these steps I've just outlined require political will at the highest levels. And are ultimately political decisions. Fortunately, both in Japan and in China, we have new leaders, and hopefully they'll have the political will to sort of calm the situation down and prevent what I think is an inherently dangerous situation from escalating further. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Samuel. Thank you for giving me this chance to stay at the podium again, because I'm not a stranger to this kind of podium. It reminds me of my role in the Foreign Ministry to act as a spokesperson. That was almost 8 months ago. And it's really a privilege to come to this university and to be able to communicate with a large, a strong presence of audience from the universities, world-renowned universities, including Harvard and MIT. And I'm particularly delighted to sit with this very strong panel to talk about this hot topic. Let me first say a few words on the overall Sino-Japanese relations. Almost 1 week ago, I think that was last Saturday, I went with my wife and my little boy to Tidal Basin to enjoy the cherry blossom in Washington, D.C. And I was not only thrilled by the beauty of the cherry, which was not yet in a full bloom. But I was also thrilled by the harmonious coexistence of Chinese culture and Japanese culture on this occasion. I watched a group of local Chinese girls who performed traditional Chinese dances on the stage of the Cherry Blossom Festival. And it was applauded by large crowds of visitors, including both Chinese and Japanese. So this, I think on the ground, when I was on the ground, I think perhaps everybody would agree with me that when you were on the ground, you never thought of those rocks in the East China Sea, right? So this, I think, demonstrate that both China and Japan can live together in a harmonious way, to use a very fashionable word in China. It also, revitalized my memory of our long-standing friendship between China and Japan. It's not necessary for me to list all those interactions between our two countries. But as late Premier Zhou Enlai once said that he characterized China-Japan relations as, friendship of more than 2,000 years, and which was interrupted by a traumatic and unfortunate past of about 50 years. I think that everybody knows that dates back to 1895 to 1945, right? But, I mean, people tend to focus very much on the past 50 years, which is unfortunate, but let's not forget the 2,000 years, which I think is important for us. And if you want to have a better and objective understanding of China-Japan relations, you've got to put this relationship in kind of a context. I think in the past 40 years since we established or normalized our relations between China and Japan, we have witnessed a great progress in terms of our bilateral relations. Now, I think we have a kind of strategic relationship based on mutual benefits. And our bilateral relations are among the most important ones in each other's foreign policy. Japan is China's second largest trading partner, and China is the largest trading partner of Japan. And in our statistics, I think Japan runs a trade deficit, trade surplus with China, which is quite unusual because everybody, I mean, perhaps are used to the complaining of trade deficit with China. But in terms of the case of Japan, I think the Chinese side has a trade deficit. That's in our statistics. And I think both countries benefit from the good relations in the past 40 years. I mean, China has received support and assistance in its modernization process. And this, I believe, the Chinese people will never forget. But also the Japanese, likewise, I think Japanese economy benefits a lot from Chinese economic development and China's development. Now, I think both of our two countries are at a important juncture of our own development. China is involved in kind of restructuring its economic pattern so as to make it a sustainable one. And Japan is working very hard for the past decades to revitalize its economy again. So I think a healthy and stable bilateral relations will only serve the interest of our two countries. So it's not less important, it's actually more important for both of our two countries. I'm happy to see that although we are in a kind of a difficult political, we are in a kind of a political difficulties at this moment, but both sides still stress that the bilateral relation is a very important one. Secondly, about the current dispute on Diaoyu Islands, a couple of points. First, Diaoyu Islands belongs to China, and there is ample of evidence to demonstrate that. And I think it's absolutely not in Japan's advantage to argue this in terms of a historical perspective, because China has a long history of 5,000 years. And secondly, China did not start the crisis. China only reacts to it. I mean, I still remember that was last April, right? Unfortunately, I mean, Governor Ishihara announced his decision or his desire to purchase the island in Washington, D.C. On the occasion of the Cherry Blossom Festival, which was unfortunate. And I hope he probably would not make that kind of a remarks again this year. I don't know whether he's going to come to D.C. or not. Hopefully not. And we were very much shocked at that moment by this announcement, because at that time we were very much involved in a kind of a celebration of the 40 years anniversary of normalization of our diplomatic ties. I was personally involved in this preparatory process. We actually prepared, well, a lot of kind words for the celebration of this occasion, but ultimately, I mean, we hadn't got the chance to say that. The tension in Diaoyu Island, of course, is the least thing we want to see when China is focusing on its domestic development. In order to make sure that we can develop in a sustainable way, I think the top priority for our foreign policy is to ensure that we have a sound and stable environmental position, especially in our neighboring countries. And we clearly understand that we have a bunch of difficulties and challenges to overcome in our reform and opening up process. So this is a situation that China did not think of at that time, and we had to react to that. Thirdly, China is still committed to manage and control the situations there through peaceful dialogue and negotiations with Japan. But for us to achieve that goal, I think first and foremost, Japan has to face the reality and admit that there is a territorial dispute. I mean, at this moment, the Japanese government is still denying that, which is not helpful. I mean, this is a fact that the whole world sees clearly. So it's if we want to have a kind of a solution to this dispute, you've got to face to the reality. And secondly, the status quo was broken by the purchasing of or nationalization of the Diaoyu Island of the Japanese side. So it is not fair to ask China to still stick to the previous, whether it's a tacit agreement or an open agreement. I think perhaps Japan has to face the reality that we have to coexist in these areas, in these waters. Thirdly, Japan should refrain from taking further, provocative actions or making some irresponsible remarks, which might escalate the situation there. And fourthly, the two sides should work together to avoid kind of an accident, which I believe two sides would not like to see. And this is the area where we have a common interest and where we need to talk about. I mean, nobody wants a military conflict in this area, right? And even and fourth, the dispute over Diaoyu Island is not, the full picture of Sino-Japanese relations. It's a pity that this very important relation should have been hijacked by certain irresponsible politician in the Japanese side. And I still believe that is the common aspiration of both Chinese and Japanese people to further develop our relations, although, just now, some of our political scientists show that the sentiment towards each other is coming to a very low point. But, if you look at this kind of, twists and turns happen time and again in the history of our bilateral relations. So we should never give up the hope that we would work together to improve the relations between us. And last but not least, I would like to talk about say a few words on the U.S. position on Diaoyu Island. I think this is not and should not become an issue between China and the United States. And the United States says time and again that it does not take side over this territorial dispute. And we hope that the U.S. side would commit to its promise without taking sides and without sending kind of a wrong message to the outside world. Now we have both the leadership coming into place, and we are now at a new point to build up this already very strong relationship. So we should not let this issue become a kind of difficulty between the two sides to further our relations. And finally, I think both sides perhaps at this moment don't have a kind of a perfect solution to this island. And we are watching the situations. We are trying to exercise restraint. But perhaps we have to admit that this generation is not smart enough to resolve this issue. So perhaps it's more realistic or practical for us to manage it and to put it under control and leave it to the next generation, which might be smarter than us. That has already been done by our old generation of leaders. And if we can't find a perfect solution, I think it's better that we leave it there and hopefully can be resolved by more talented people, perhaps from this room or from other places. And with that, I conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yukio Okamoto. Before coming here, I had wished that my Chinese counterpart at this seminar will be a mean-looking, tough, unsophisticated man, so that I would feel no reservation to relentlessly refute what he was going to say. But I hate Dick Samuels for having brought such a nice, sophisticated, soft-spoken gentleman, to whom I would say I agree most of what he had said, except, of course, the core issue that the islands belong to China. I don't want to spend too much time on our legal arguments. I'll make the long Q&A available at the Starr forum at mit.edu if you ask for it. It's a 30 pages long document, quite interesting. And it is listing every Chinese argument with Japanese refutation that these are all groundless claims. So I'm not going to spend too much time on how we think we have beyond any doubt that the islands are Japan's. We incorporated those islands in 1895. And for 6 years, no more than that, China has never challenged the Japanese position. Until in 1968, the UN Commission issued a report that there are possibly abundant oil reserve in those areas. And then suddenly, after 76 years of silence, China said the islands are ours. And then, yes, Mike has really explained well the present polemics surrounding the two countries. But yes, it is true that there have been shelving agreement claimed by the Chinese side, which Japan denies. The fact of the truth is that Mr. Deng Xiaoping said, let's leave the issue to the future wisdom of wiser generation and not talk about it. Prime Minister Fukuda did not reply, which was taken as the silent consent to the shelving agreement. But as Mike said, Japan still maintains that we did not agree to such shelving arrangement. But anyhow, in 1992, China established this territorial waters law and included senkakus in their territory. And this was the beginning of the mess. And then as Chinese nationalism grew, things are getting worse and worse. I harbor no optimism for the future. Number one, for mounting Chinese nationalism among young youth, especially. And number two, maybe this is only my personal conjecture, but the geostrategic implication of Senkaku Islands will grow in the future. Maybe this is a very interesting theme for your research, and well, tell me if I'm wrong. China formulated a two-tier maritime strategy in 1980s under Mr. Deng Xiaoping when he was the chairman of the party military committee, with the cooperation of the famous admiral, Mr. Liu Hua-chin. This strategy had two steps. The first step is to have complete military control within the South China Sea and East China Sea at around 2010. So when China was in that stage, Senkaku Islands are just mere uninhabited small islands at the northern tip of the targeted waters. China didn't mind what would happen to these islands. But China has already completed this first stage. Now they are on to the second tier of their maritime strategy, which is to go across what we call the first island chain from Kyushu to Okinawa Islands to Taiwan to the Philippines, and go out to the Pacific and to acquire what we call A2AD capability, anti-access area denial capability, within the Pacific, west of what we call second island chain, which is from Tokyo down to Izu Islands, to Bonin Islands, to Saipan, Guam, and all the way down to Papua New Guinea. A2AD strategy means a capability to destroy American naval forces should they enter those waters to engage in hostile activities with China, such as fighting for Taiwan. Now, suddenly, the locations of Senkaku have acquired completely new strategic implication. Now it sits at the gateway, right in the middle of the gateway, for Chinese passage into the Pacific. So what if Japan erects a radar station there? Chinese naval strategy will have to be compromised. So as China will be increasingly interested and becoming more and more aggressive in coming to the Pacific Ocean, the issue of Senkaku will have even more difficult dimension to it. What do we do about it? One way is, I agree with Mr. Liu Weimin, to defer the matter to be solved by the future generations. Mike Mochizuki said there are 4 groups of people: appeasers, militarizers, balancers, and shelvers. I don't belong to any one of them because I think any one is feasible. I would like to call myself a realist. And I think, interestingly, Mr. Liu belongs to this group. I think we should refer the matter to ICJ, to which, of course, China doesn't agree. Leave it in the hands of International Court of Justice. This is not Japanese governmental position, but I think Japan should, if China brings this issue to the court, the two-thirds making an announcement beforehand that we will abide by the verdict of ICJ, whatever it is. Second, we don't want any military conflict there. Of course, it's foolhardy to think that there will be a full-scale war between Japan and China. But, you know, accidents can happen. What if 1 or 2 Chinese sailors get killed because of that action? There will be an explosion of anti-Japan movement in China, uncontrollable, And the economic relationship between the two countries will come to a virtual end. What if there are one or two men killed on the Japanese side? This is going to be the first war dead for Japan since 1945. And there will be a drastic swing of national sentiment towards the way we came back from. And we really cannot risk even one casualty between the two countries. There has to be a strong mechanism to preserve non-combat, even an accident. Unfortunately, in my view, and my experience tells that Japan and China cannot achieve this bilaterally. We have to have an intervention of the United States to, not as the ally of Japan-US Security Treaty, but as an objective officiator. Because whenever we talk with China bilaterally, the talks are always going to be a zero-sum game. And the conclusion is never conciliatory. We have to have a third party who has the authority and the power to deliver the agreement of non-deterioration. And I think this is the United States. We understand the US position that it does not take sides on territorial disputes. We understand that. US does not, for instance, take sides over Falkland or Malvinas conflict between Britain and Argentine. It's always neutral. But of course, security treaty is different. Security treaty says Japan and the United States fight together should Japan be attacked. Now, it is right that some people in Japan says United States must come to aid Japan the minute there is a military conflict around the Senkaku area. I think we should not push United States to this extent. The defense of Senkaku Islands is the very clear role of Japan's self-defense forces. We should not expect the Seventh Fleet to come fight with us with Chinese Liberation Army. Then what is Japan-US Security Treaty for? Should skirmishes between Japan and China around Senkaku evolve into a larger military conflict, that's when the security treaty will be activated or should be activated. But of course, China doesn't want to have war with the United States. And we ourselves really don't want United States to go to war with China. Good US-China relationship is indispensable for Japan as well. I think Mr. Liu would agree with me on this point. So this is a very, very delicate situation where we have to control the public opinions of the two countries. I'm sorry to say that Chinese nationalism has gone beyond the limit of rationalism. Even if ICJ is to deliver a verdict that this is clearly the Japanese islands, Chinese youth would then have massive demonstration against ICJ's ruling. So the issue is very deep-rooted. It is unfair not to touch upon what Japan did during the wartime. And in my view, I have a very sympathetic view to what Chinese are saying against Japan. We have apologized. We had expressed our sense of remorse, pledge never to do it again. But Japan should do more to tell our children that we did invade China, to tell our children where Chinese deep-rooted animosity towards Japan originates from. We don't school enough in our schools about the past Japanese guilt. So while we really wish China to change the content of its education, clearly implanting excessive loathing, if not outright hatred, towards Japan. But at the same time, we have to change our educational system or the content of the education that really younger generation and children should learn more about our past. So I'm talking about maybe 10, 20 years later, when the two young generations are better equipped with wisdom and objective knowledge of where the two countries should go and agree to. We have to wait that long till the fundamental solution of this issue. Till then, we have to have a midterm regime to avoid any unwarranted military conflict between the two. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the non-expert on the panel, so Dick must have thought I had something useful to say about these issues. I'm going to talk about the implications for the United States and also for the U.S.-China relationship of the dispute over these islands. And in some ways, you might, if you didn't know, I guess all of you, since you're here, must know that these islands are probably much more important than just the conflict over them. I mean, they're small islands. It's hard to figure out why there would be any conflict at all. Or to some extent, why we'd even be having this panel. But in some complicated way, it's possible that these islands wouldn't say that they're a linchpin to the future of U.S.-China relations, but they actually have the possibility of playing a quite significant role in the evolution of that relationship. And I think I'm going to try to sketch out why that's the case and sort of broaden the lens beyond the islands and to see why they're even more important than has already been suggested. So I think the place to start is to say that there are two very different views about the potential implications of China's rise, speaking in very broad terms. One view is that there's very, very likely that there will be conflict between a rising power and the declining power, China being the rising power in this case and the United States being the declining power. I'm not going to go into I'd be glad to answer questions about it, but this is a well-established view both in international relations theory, but also now specifically in the debate in the United States over the rise of China. If you have this pessimistic view, then the islands actually don't matter very much. There's going to be conflict anyway, and the island dispute, as well as the conflicts or the competition in the South China Sea, are simply a reflection of the power transition And one way or another, you're going to get competition and arms racing and potentially conflict. And so they're just sort of part of this much larger picture and don't have much impact on the outcome. There is an alternative view, which is in fact my view, well, not to say it's the right view, but it is my view, is that there is the potential for a rising power to rise peacefully, and that can go relatively smoothly, and that the main ingredients for that type of peaceful rise actually exist in the geopolitics of the U.S.-China relationship. The United States can continue to be very secure as China rises. There's no security threat. We have many shared economic interests. But most importantly, China's rise does not threaten U.S. security. And that's the deep source of danger between a rising and a declining power. If you have that view, though, it's not a view that says that the rise will happen peacefully. It simply says that the pressures created by international structure allow for that peaceful rise. And then a very important issue is how the political relationships between the countries and its allies, in this case China on the one hand and the United States and its allies in Northeast Asia, how that relationship evolves. And so the question then, and it would seem like quite a puzzle, how in the world could it be that these almost non-existent islands, which is to say they've got incredibly small, they take up a very small space, and even if you think about the area around them in the sea, it's a very small amount of space. How could they possibly be the factor of any sort in this relationship? So I think that in the overall evolution of the relationship. And so the way I would sketch it, and it actually is somewhat of it's a rationalist type or rational argument, although I think a lot of what we're seeing is not rational, goes very briefly something like this, which is states tend to be afraid of rising powers because the increasing military capability of a rising power is potentially dangerous. But the key factor that determines then how this rise goes, a key factor, not the only factor, but a key factor is the declining power's assessment of the rising power's goals. And if the rising power is understood to be an ambitious state, one that, for instance, wants to change the political status quo, wants to take territory, et cetera, then the declining power has smaller incentives to cooperate with the rising power. Right now, the United States, in fact, and the international community has relatively little information about China's long-term goals. And so what's happening is that the conflicts in the East China Sea and the South China Sea are providing the majority of information that the United States and other countries have. And so if it looks to you, as it does to many people, or in many countries, that China is being very assertive in the East China Sea and even more assertive in the South China Sea, countries are saying this may be a kind of power that is going to be dangerous once it has risen. It's still rising, but we're looking at what should U.S. policy be over the next few decades, and how cooperative should we be, how much should we tighten our alliances, what kind of concessions should we make to China? And as China looks more threatening, the concessions we should make are smaller and the intensity of the competition is larger. And so it's not that the islands themselves are so important, although they're not unimportant. I mean, we've heard the possibilities. I should raise these possibilities. I mean, it is possible the United States could get drawn into a conflict. It still would be quite unusual for that small conflict to become a large conflict, but we could aid in the conflict. It's possible that we will intensify our alliance with Japan to help give Japan confidence in the face of a potentially growing Chinese threat. But the bigger issue is what we're learning from these disputes about China's goals. And many people are coming to the conclusion, and I think we don't see this fully stated in U.S. policy, but even U.S. policy and statements are leaning this way, that China in 2013 looks to be a more ambitious state and a potentially more dangerous state than it did in 2008, let's say. And so I think that, I wouldn't say that's the only danger, but that's the biggest danger and the key issue over the East China and South China Seas. In the extreme version, but it's not one that's that I would dismiss at this point, and this is even changing it in my thinking. It's since 2008. Some people have come to the conclusion that China's goal will be to push the United States out of Northeast Asia. That it's eventually, like the that eventually it will want the United States to pull out, not maintain at least a forward deploy presence in Japan. You might say, well, that would be an incredibly ambitious and unreasonable power. Keep in mind that the U.S. Monroe Doctrine says we don't want other major powers in the Western Hemisphere. And that in many ways, if China came to that position, it wouldn't be acting that differently than the United States did, although the history is very different and the trajectory would be very different. But if what we're seeing is the beginning of a China that is that ambitious, that wants to be the dominant power in its region, then that's a China that the United States is very likely to act toward forcefully, by which I don't mean using force, but by reinforcing its alliances in the region. And it's likely to be the kind of China that will generate very intense balancing behavior by other countries in Northeast Asia. And we're starting to see these reactions in the region. And we need to keep in mind that China is still a relatively weak power. This is how countries are starting to react to a weak China that has grown tremendously in its economic and military potential over 20 years, but is still not the dominant power in its region. And militarily, the United States is the dominant power, without any question. And arguably, Japan is much more capable in many dimensions, military dimensions, at sea than China. But if you look down the road and look at the Chinese GNP and look at its military potential, China will, over time, not definitely, but likely have this capability to actually challenge the United States rather fully in its region, not globally. And so then it's that assessment of China's goals that becomes key. And the message is the wrong message, I believe, from China's perspective. So I would say why I have a somewhat different view on how China should deal with these islands. But I realize, it's, in a sense, it's not possible, given the way that China views the islands. But what I see is a policy that, from China's perspective, is clearly self-defeating. Because what's happening is that many countries are becoming afraid of China. I think they would be somewhat afraid of China as its power increased anyway. But they're becoming much more afraid than they would be otherwise, and they're responding in that way, in a way that you respond when you're fearful. The United States is so-called rebalancing or pivoting to Asia. It says that it's not because of China. You can say whatever you want, but it's hard to figure out why else you would do that. We're rebalancing because over time we're concerned about China's military capability. Japan is increasingly worried about China's military capability. Eventually, particularly if its economy starts to become somewhat stronger, it will very likely reinvest or further invest in what is already a very large military. And we're starting to see cooperation among many countries in the region that are afraid of China, even though they're very willing to trade with China. So this is bad for China in a variety of ways. Eventually, China, for the reasons that Tara was saying, will become fearful of its encirclement. It will be, with the exception of Russia, facing potentially hostile neighbors on its borders, sea borders or land borders, mostly sea borders in this case, which will make it more determined to improve its own military capabilities. And so there is this kind of spiral that will take place not only over the islands, but in the region, and to some extent maybe even beyond the region, but mostly in the region. So this will be costly for all players, because this over a long time will be militarily costly, but it's also politically costly and dangerous, because countries that are more afraid of each other find it harder to resolve disputes. They will find it harder to resolve disputes in the East China and South China Seas than they would when their relationships were better and in which they were less militarized. There's the possibility that even though relations are good between China and Taiwan now, that strained relations between the United States and its allies will play into future strains between China and Taiwan. And if there are crises, those crises will be harder to resolve. And so you've seen us, people on the panel, experts have trouble explaining how do you get a small crisis over these islands into a big conflict. The good news is it's hard, but it's easier once political relations are strained and countries are actually deeply fearful. So if I were China, which obviously I'm not nearly China, but if I were, I would think that China should be willing to make really large concessions in the East China and South China Seas, because its material interests are very, very limited. As long as the sea lanes are open, these islands don't matter. The resources are minuscule. I think the potential military implications of those islands, one side controlling them or the other, is exaggerated, although there are very few available full analyses. So it's an odd situation, and I think the question you could ask back is, well, how could it be that relatively unimportant pieces of territory, of terrain, could spoil a relationship? And I think if they were the only thing in this relationship that had the potential for strain, then they wouldn't. But they're not. You've got a rising power that has growing international influence, economically and militarily. So that's a challenge in any situation. You have, as we've heard from two different directions, bad history between the countries. That makes a rising power much more of a challenge. But if the countries were able to essentially avoid military competition, and if there were possible concessions on both sides, and you could say on all sides, given that the United States is a potential player in restraint and concessions, then it's quite possible that China's rise would be a peaceful one, for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning. But a relatively small number of focused disputes that put into doubt either side's military capabilities and, most importantly, their long-term goals, do have the potential to poison the relationship and generate these dangers. So I think that's the bigger picture. There's some danger that it exaggerates the importance of the islands, but I actually am surprised and sort of sad that it's looking like it doesn't. The relationship really has changed in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's the East China and South China Seas that are, I think, the driving factors. And so it's not only China's responsibility, but if I were giving advice, I think there's more room for this actually on China's side to signal what it wants in the long term. It's the rising power. It's this country that has the potential to reshape Asia and Northeast Asia over the next few decades. So it's the key player in terms of providing information to the international community about what it would like the future of the region to look like. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much to the entire panel. We have some time left, and I'm staying within their limits, the limits that were set. What I think we'll do is, if you'd come to the microphone, there are microphones on both sides. Please identify yourself and ask a question rather than make a pronouncement. And what I think we'll do, to the extent that's possible, and what I'd like to do is to take clusters of 3, because we do have a limited amount of time. I'll take a cluster of 3, turn it to the panel. They can pick and choose among the questions to respond to, and then if we have time, we'll do another cluster. Why don't we start with Professor Roy?
Thank you very much. Kenneth Roy from Political Science and Engineering Systems, MIT. The question that I have is directed largely to Mr. Okamoto and Mr. Liu, with all due deference to my colleagues. I was encouraged by the tone and temper of the remarks and the eloquent defense of kicking cans down the road, pushing things ahead to future generations. But to reach those future generations will require extraordinarily careful management of the current crisis. And having been in Beijing and Tokyo, the tenor and tone domestically in both countries is dangerous now. How specifically would you move to contain or limit the risk of military conflict to reach that somewhat uncertain and distant future that both of you alluded to as our goal?
Thanks, Ken. And from this side?
Hi, my name is Dan Liu. I'm a sophomore at MIT. Thank you all for your remarks. Do any of you see any parallels and differences between this issue and that of the Liancourt rocks, known to South Korea as Tokdo and Japan Takashima, but whose administration is controlled by South Korea? Thanks.
Great. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jinshu Zhang. I'm first year material science and engineering PhD student. And this question is directed to Mr. Okamoto. So in your excellent talk, at one point you resorted to the mediation of the International Court of Justice. At another, you talked about the intervention of the United States. So I would like to ask you to further elaborate a little bit on whether you think it should be a mediation of a third nation state, or it should be intervention of an international organization. Thank you.
Okay, great. 3 very good questions, and I'm happy to have, I don't know, Charlie, do you want to weigh in, or shall we start with Yukio, since you were identified by 2 questioners, at least 3. Thanks. Well, you can stay there, Yukio, because we have you wired.
Okay, well,
Thanks.
thank you very much for those questions, excellent ones. The Japanese dispute with doctor, I'll begin with. Yes, it has the same nature. And we have already notified to the Korean government that Japan wants to bring the issue to ICJ, to which Korea has not complied yet. And probably they will never say yes, because it is undoubtedly theirs. Why do we go to international court? I'm saying, this is in reference to the last question as well, that in case of Senkaku, although we have the 100% control over those islands, if China asks to go to ICJ, as Japan is doing for Takeshima with Korea, Japan should accept to go to the ICJ and accept the final ruling. The intervention by the United States I refer to is a midterm regime to secure the mechanism for non-confrontation, non-military confrontation around those waters. And it's a political intervention I was referring to. Ken Oe has asked a very difficult question. Well, then how are we going to do it? I think I have already said that we need to change our educational system, both of us. You may think that the effect will take place maybe a long time ago, not in time, to solve the issue. But that starting of the movement will definitely change the national sentiments of the 2 countries, especially the young people. Yes, our feeling of friendship towards China now is a record time low. But as Mr. Liu Weimin said, we have really 2,000 years of friendship history, and it is possible, not impossible, to direct the 2 peoples towards that direction. So we have to keep up many daily and individual agreements with China. We have so many things for the room for cooperation: the water, the environment, joint development of natural gas, and so forth, till we get to that final stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Liu?
Okay. First of all, about the management of current situations. I think it's important that the 2 countries can conduct diplomatic negotiations over this very difficult issue. We actually had 3 rounds of diplomatic negotiations in last year at the level of vice foreign minister, and we had another, I guess it's 4 rounds of negotiations at the lower level. And although it did not, produce a visible result, I think it's helpful that both sides understand each other's position. So with the transition of the leadership completed this year, I think it's important that we might be able to restart that kind of negotiations. But in order to make these negotiations produce tangible results or to make some progress, I think it's highly important for the Japanese side to recognize that there is a territorial dispute there. Otherwise, does not make sense to hold this kind of talks. And both sides, I think, worry about a kind of unexpected incident or an accident happening on the sea. And from our side, we don't want that kind of things happen. We have exercised our utmost control to avoid that kind of incident. And we hope, Japan will, like us, do the same. On the role of ICJ, to put it simple, I think it's not China's position to refer it to ICJ. I understand the Japanese government does not support this kind of suggestions as well. It's not the official position of the Japanese side. Ultimately, this kind of a territorial dispute have to be resolved bilaterally. We had managed to resolve most of our land disputes with our neighboring countries, except with India. So 95% of our land disputes had been resolved through bilateral channels. And we do believe that I think it's the fundamental way, and it's perhaps the only way for countries directly involved in the territorial disputes to sit down and come together to negotiate. And I would very much doubt the role of ICJ. And on the role of the United States, I think you will be surprised if I say I agree with my colleague, Japanese colleague here, because again, I think this is a bilateral issue, and the intervention of the United States can only complicate the effort to resolve this very difficult issue. And I think the United States perhaps will refrain from doing that. Their public official position is very clear. And both China-U.S. relations and U.S.-Japan relations are important ones for the United States. And I would think that it will be quite difficult, right, for the United States to mediate in this process. So the best way, or to strike a balance. So the best way, perhaps, for the United States is to refrain, to step a few steps backward, and let the two sides to resolve this issue bilaterally.
Mike, you had something?
I wanted to address the question about Takeshima and Tokyo to tie it in with Charlie's really important point. I agree with Charlie that China's behavior in the last several years has been self-defeating, and therefore the rational response at the international system level would be then to pull back, and maybe even make some concessions, but at least pull back. But the problem is that it may be rational at the system level, but if you think of it as a two-level game, at the domestic level, I think it's becoming increasingly costly for the Chinese leadership. And so in some sense, the cost for that has to be lowered. And here, I think what Okamoto-san said is very important, that in the long run, Japan educating its future generations about the past to the extent that then there can be some movement on historical reconciliation might ultimately reduce the domestic costs of some concession. But the problem, the real danger that I fear is that the longer that this crisis continues, this is going to become a historical issue, like the Takeshima-Tokto issue. It won't be just about military issues or territory, but it will be about history. And when I was in China in January, I began to hear that discourse. It's very much a symbol of Japan hasn't come to grips with its past aggression. And then that raises the cost domestically for Chinese leaders to make the kind of rational concessions that Charlie's talking about.
Thanks. We're bumping up against the notional end of the event, but fortunately, I said we take two groups of three, and there are three of you remaining at the microphone. So why don't we take questions from the three of you, and then run the table, and then I'll thank everyone. Sir.
Gentlemen, thank you. Jordan Foley, MIT master's student. Question for anybody who can talk about the Rim of the Pacific exercises in 2014 and China's inclusion. Dr. Mochizuki, sir, you started by inciting Thucydides, so I'll continue to quote him and saying that the reason men go to war is fear, honor, and interest. And to me, this is a prime example of that, but not only inadvertent escalation due to naval miscommunications. My question is the inclusion of China in RIMPAC 2014 good, bad, does it not matter? Is this kicking the can down the road, or is this going to actually lead to something we can see that'll be positive? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Carrie Bergen. I work in the television and film industry in China and have been living there for about 8 years. This is a question for Mr. Glaser, and I also would like a follow-up for Mr. Liu, if that's possible. Mr. Glaser, you talked about the international community and the United States looking to China's actions with regards to the Diaoyu Islands as an indication of what they want long-term in the East Asia region. But my question is, shouldn't you take into consideration that China's relationship with Japan is somewhat isolated, and is that really a fair basis for such a judgment? Are you looking to other actions on China's behalf in this region? I mean, if you look back to the Sino-Japanese War, and particularly the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the strong unfortunately, still residual anti-Japanese sentiment in China now, this may not be, a fair basis for such an overall judgment on China's hopes and desires for establishing themselves in the region, or, as you put it, in terms of how they want other people to view them as a rising power.
Thank
and
you.
Leo, I would hope to have your input on how you feel about Mr. Glaser's comments.
Thank you. And the last question.
Hi, my name is Kotaro Shiojiri. I'm a student at Harvard Law School, and my question is to Professor Mochizuki. You mentioned 4 schools of thoughts about the Korean policymakers, and I believe that Mr. Liu would belong to the chauffeurs, because he mentioned that we're going to leave the issue to the next generation, and we hope that we, the next generation, can keep up with that expectations. And on the other hand, Mr. Okamoto has mentioned himself as a realist, which is the 5th category. And what is your reaction to that? And are you ready to change your categorizations? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And so why don't we start with Charlie, and we'll just come down to Mike at the end. Go ahead, Charlie.
So on the question of whether this particular dispute is a good indication of China's overall or long-term goals, I think the answer is no, not by itself, and maybe not even in the context of other available information. but we're in a critical moment, I mean, where the moment is decades long, where we're trying to figure out what China's goals are, and we have relatively little information, so the available information matters a lot. I would also say it's not quite my view. I'm actually still more agnostic about what China's goals are, but I'm sort of reporting what I see sort of across the US political spectrum, including in the academy and the government and so forth, that people, including people who know a lot about this crisis, but also most people who don't know much about it, see China as being very assertive. But why might we read a lot into it? Okay, so the first reason is this, the stakes, the value to most people of these islands looks to be relatively low. And so if China is willing to pay high costs for something that's relatively low, it suggests that it may be very ambitious in general, because why would it incur such potentially large political costs? So it just makes people wonder. Second, it's not only the East China Sea, it's also, and more importantly, the South China Sea. Chinese interactions with the Philippines in particular, but also across the South China Sea more broadly. So it's been assertive in other areas in ways that are not directly related to this island dispute. So its behavior seems to be broader. Three, very naturally as a growing power, but nevertheless, it is building up its military rather dramatically if you look at the pace, if not the absolute level. So there are a number of indicators, none of which are probably very good in and of them narrowly, but are basically all that we have. And then you put that in the broader context, or not all that we have, but they're the visible new pieces of information we have, and you put it in the broader context of a rising power. So I think that's, not to say it's the right conclusion, it is the conclusion that the sort of, even more than the modal part of the spectrum is drawing. And if nothing else, China should recognize, I would say, it should recognize what the result of its actions are, even if they're not the right reactions. So that is what's happening. I think that probably reactions are being, people believe we're learning more than actually is appropriate at this stage. But I think we're learning something. The other thing I would say, which is related to Mike's comment, is that people are wondering, why is it that China, not only what does it want, but why does it want that? And to the extent, there's sort of two very different but complementary stories. One is the leadership wants to have this kind of assertive policy. That's sort of worrisome, but that might be less worrisome that the leadership is influenced from below by this sort of Chinese nationalism, which seems to be growing. And so to the extent that it's either of those, but particularly it's the sort of Chinese nationalism, which is not specific to the East China Sea, then what we're seeing does provide much broader information about China's potential goals. And we're in a worrisome way, if you're looking in a multi-decade way, you would think that if this is how this nationalism and sort of redefined role for China is playing out when China is still relatively weak, how will it be acting and demanding when it's relatively strong? So that's the spirit of the information that's being provided. And I think we can disagree about how accurate all of it is, but it is part of a bigger picture that people are trying to put together. And then lastly, I'll just say when it comes to security issues, states tend to be pretty cautious or risk averse. So the United States and its allies are not going to say, we don't really know, let's wait a few decades and see, because it will be too late in a sense. And so we are responding now, we'll respond increasingly over time, and then there's a path dependence to this. And so what gets started now on weak information can train something that's not easy to turn around and is somewhat self-fulfilling.
Thank you. Yukio? Do you want to respond to any of the questions?
Thank you. Just 30 seconds. About Japanese willingness to go to the ICJ, since we have, as I said, asked Korean government to go to the ICJ and expressing regrets that Koreans are not agreeing to it, it will be highly inconsistent if China wants to bring the issue to the court and Japan says no. So Mr. Min is right. It is not our official position yet, but I'm very, very confident that Japan will comply with in going to the court.
Mr. Liu?
Okay, a couple of responses. First, on the RIMPAC 2014, I understand China will, for the first time, join some parts of the military exercise. I think that's mostly primarily on the kind of humanitarian disaster relief, something like that. So China is still not, a full member of this RIMPAC exercise. But the fact that China agree to join this drill shows the depth of the military contacts between our two countries. And I think this is helpful to further promote our mutual trust and mutual confidence. And I think Asia Pacific is, kind of a test ground for our two countries to build a new type, what we call a new type of state-to-state relations, which is I think quite unprecedented in history, because if you recall that the rising power always collided with the established power in the past. But now the two countries feel that we have a better option to live together and to perhaps to benefit from a kind of a peaceful coexistence and peaceful perhaps competition with a healthy competition with each other. And secondly, on the long-term strategy of China, for us it's quite clear. I think we want to build a world community, and first of all, in Asia Pacific, we want to build a Asia Pacific community of common interest, and we've been investing a lot to build up the relations with our neighboring countries, including Japan and including ASEAN countries. And I do not agree that the recent disputes between China and Japan and China and some certain ASEAN countries demonstrate the deterioration of our relations with, our neighbors. I think those disputes have been there for quite a long time. And generally speaking, I think it's a fact that we have a better relationship with our neighbors, without which perhaps the U.S. would not invest more on this region, because the U.S. recognized that China has a rising influence in this region, has a better relations with its neighbors, that the United States feel that it perhaps is obliged to invest more to improve its relations. So I don't believe that it complies with the fact that China's relations with the neighboring countries are deteriorating. And as far as these disputes, there is a lot of rhetoric on China's assertiveness. It's never our intention, to provoke this kind of incident in our neighboring area. China only reacts to it, especially when it comes to sovereignty issue. There is no room for China to back down, right? And we will safeguard our sovereignty, but we will also, safeguard our relationship with neighboring countries, including, the United States. The United States, although it's a little bit far away, but we would rather see it as a kind of a neighbor in the western part of the Pacific. As far as the increase of Chinese military strength, I would say that with the rapid development of China, perhaps it's understandable that China should have a military which is compatible with its status. And this military is not for the use of aggression or invasion or or kind of provocative actions. It's primarily for the safeguarding of our own, defend our own territory. And by the way, I mean, China perhaps is among, I mean, the major powers which is still divided. I mean, we still have the Taiwan issue there, right? So we still have to maintain, I mean, a kind of a certain military strength here. And we have a long border with neighboring countries. We have so many, I mean, neighboring countries. But I would say that this China never sent its soldiers, except, I mean, under the United Nations flag, to other places, to other countries. And so it is still our policy that we will not send our soldiers to other countries to guard against a certain country or that sort of thing. But of course, we will be very much delighted if we can play a bigger role in terms of the maintenance of international stability and peace. I mean, you have witnessed Chinese Navy patrolling in the Indian Ocean, fighting the pirates there. We are working together with European countries, with the United States, and even perhaps with South Korea and Japan, Japanese Navy there to preserve the safety of the sea land at that part. So, I mean, the intention is very clear. We want to play some role to safeguard the international stability and to defend our own country. It's not for kind of aggression there. As far as China's nationalism is concerned, I am sometimes sometimes have difficulty in understanding why this issue has become such a hot topic in the outside world. I mean, China is becoming more and more liberalized, so inevitably the society is much more diversified. You're going to hear different kind of views, opinions, just like the countries. When I mean, in the past days, when our foreign policy was not very much influenced by this kind of different opinions, well, some countries or some people would say, well, China is a authoritarian state. The government dictates all, and China is a kind of a repressive regime. I mean, decisions only taken by the central government only. But when we have this kind of, when we become to listen to the different opinions of the society, and there is another voice saying that well, China is trying to take good use of these different opinions. So I really have some kind of, for me, it's some kind of a double standards. I have a difficulty in understanding that. But I mean, just like other countries, every country has its own patriotism, I say. I would say when I came here not long ago, just 7 months, but I feel very much that we actually can learn a lot from the United States in doing this kind of patriotism education. I have to admit that we are still not that experienced. And so I don't believe the government, you've got to have every kind of voices in a society, perhaps sometimes irrational voices there. But I don't believe that that kind of voices will become the mainstream. And the government will be kind of hijacked by this kind of irrational voices there.
Thank you. Taylor?
Let me just comment briefly on the question about RIMPAC. I think it's good, and it's good for two reasons. The first is that it's important to deepen the military-to-military relationship between the United States and China if we are to achieve Charlie's preferred outcome. You need ways of building trust and sharing information, and military-to-military ties is a very good way of doing that. But it's also good for a second reason that might not be fully appreciated. Namely, I think it helps refute arguments in China about U.S. intentions, because it shows that the United States military is willing and able to cooperate with China in a very large series of exercises that includes almost every country in the East Asian region. So not to have China in it in whatever capacity, humanitarian or otherwise, I think is a mistake and helps build a perception in China of U.S. intentions that does not support Charlie's preferred outcome. So I think it's good, and it's good for two reasons.
Thanks. Mike?
Okay, well, just very quickly, all four schools of thought that I've outlined are realist. They all have a realist logic. There is a rationality to it. I mean, if you read Professor Yabuki's book, he makes a realist argument for why Japan ought to appease China, because China is so important for Japan, and the United States is not going to back Japan if it gets into a fight with China over the Senkaku Islands. You may disagree with that realist logic, but he will see himself as being a realist. So I don't think it's that none of these are realist, and therefore Mr. Okamoto is finding another school of thought. When I listened to him, I was trying to figure out whether he's a balancer or a shelver. In his remarks, I didn't see much of the balancing. I saw more of the shelving, and so I think he fits in the shelving school, like his other colleagues from the foreign ministry.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks to everyone. Thank you for a wonderful set of questions. Thanks to the panel for an extraordinarily substantive set of presentations. I actually, listening to it, it occurred to me, I developed a theory, and I want to just share it with you, and then I'll say goodbye. But this was the first time in my memory, and I have a long memory, that there were no PowerPoints shown. So there's the theory. The theory then is there's a perfectly inverse relationship between the quality of presentations and the substance, and the absence of PowerPoint. So I'm going to encourage us all to follow this lead. But again, thanks to the panel, thanks to you all for coming, and goodbye.